We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years, since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the darkened hour.
Okay, hello Adam, and hello everyone. Today it finally comes time to talk about Operation Northwoods. Adam, go ahead. What is Operation Northwoods?
Well, Operation Northwoods was a drafted proposal which involved the Central Intelligence Agency and some elements from the Department of Defense. In it, that they would conduct acts of terrorism against U.S. military targets in Cuba and give the appearance of terrorism against U.S. citizens and blame the Cuban government, which in turn would have the public backing for a war, an invasion against Cuba. This is commonly known as a false flag. Due to the rise of communism in the 1950s in Cuba, led by the rise of Fidel Castro, the U.S. government was absolutely fearful of the continued infiltration of communism of inside U.S. interests abroad, and especially inside the United States. Just 2 years prior, during the final year of Eisenhower's tenure as president, another covert intelligence military operation was also drafted, and that was termed, it was codenamed Operation Mongoose, which was officially authorized by the newly elected President Kennedy on November 4th, 1962. Operation Mongoose was a program aimed at Cuba with the goal of removing communists from power. They aimed for a manufactured revolt against the Castro regime, which were to take place in Cuba by the fall of 1962. There would also be a new democratically affiliated government in Cuba, which in turn would be, of course, be of great interest to the United States. The operation was, of course, protected under plausible deniability in case it failed and it went public. The operation was so secret that many within the Pentagon were not even aware of its existence. Just a few people, and from the man chosen to lead Operation Mongoose was none other than Brigadier General Edward Lansdale from the United States Air Force, along with CIA Director John McCone. But it was headed to Lansdale. And a lot of people have heard this name before. Lansdale was considered one of the people that was photographed after on the day of Kennedy's assassination, when he walks by the three hobos near the police station. And this is actually depicted in the film JFK by Oliver Stone. And there was an actor portraying Lansdale, and he's actually using his hand. He waves off the hobos and almost like a signal telling me it's okay.
But the three hobos were people suspected they were CIA, right? Right.
They were arrested at the train yard by a cop that was patrolling around there, and they just brought him in. But Northwoods was originally conscripted by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyman Lemnitzer, and others who were regarded as these fringe militant elements of the Department of Defense. And they signed off on a draft, which would then be forwarded to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. who then, in return, gives it to President Kennedy. Now, the operation had many proposals. And if you read the PDF on the Joint Chiefs Report on page 7, it had a couple of incidences in which they want to establish a credible attack. And I'll read some of them off to you. Point 1, start rumors, many, use clandestine radio. 2, land friendly Cubans in uniform over the fence to stage attack on U.S. base. 3, capture Cuban-friendly saboteurs inside the base. 4, start riots near the main base, friendly Cubans. 5, blow up ammunition inside the base, start fires. 6, burn aircraft on base, sabotage. 7, lob mortar shells from outside of the base into U.S. base. And there was also other ideas. Some of the ideas Northwoods are linked to, incidentally, are affiliated with many of the conspiracy circles involving the attacks of September 11, 2001. And I'll read one off to you, which is pretty interesting if you look at it. Quote, an aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. At the designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with selected passengers or boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual aircraft would be converted to a drone. The drone aircraft and the actual aircraft would be scheduled to allow a rendezvous south of Florida. From the rendezvous point, the passengers carrying aircraft will descend to minimum altitude and go directly into an auxiliary field at Eglin Air Force Base, where arrangements will have been made to evacuate the passengers and return the aircraft to its original status. End quote. Now, this would be harder to do in today's age because of the advent of technology, cameras, cell phones. There's a lot more agencies involved that would be harder to penetrate, as opposed to something like this happening where there are no cameras and there are no electronic devices and there are no rapid technology as to where information can be passed in seconds. Something like this could be quite plausible. It would be harder today, actually, where the advent of technology.
Okay, well, that's kind of what we're talking about, right? Because a lot has been said about Operation Northwoods in relation to 9/11. Like, a lot. It's one of the central things, okay? That if you talk to people who are interested in the conspiracy of 9/11, you know, the demolition of the towers is the big thing that everyone knows about, right? That's the big talking point. But Northwoods is, you know, top 3, top 5 on the list, I would suggest, because the documents were declassified. I think they were fully declassified just inside 2001, right? Just prior to 9/11 itself. I meant to note that down. I didn't, but I think that's the correct date. So right before 9/11 happens, it's almost like, well, you know, from the perspective of, say, someone who's looking at it as a conspiracy, it's almost like the archetypal blueprint of such an event is published, where they're talking about faking shoot downs of aircraft and so on. And yeah, like, really valuable document. Probably worth talking as well about Lyman Lemster going off to Europe, because President Kennedy sacked him after, effectively sacked him right after Northwoods for
That's right.
proposing such a thing, but transferred him to be like supreme commander of NATO in Europe. And that's when you have like the false flag terrors and the Gladio operations happening there that coincides with that time period of, you know, blowings up of train stations and cars, particularly in Italy, where as carried out by right-wing groups to pin it on the Italian left, and with the backing of the Italian state and security services. So, yeah, Northwoods probably tells you more about what went on in Europe during the 60s and 70s than it does about 9/11 in some ways. Not to take away from what it says about 9/11, but there's this really, really direct link there. I think, okay, so my circuitous point is like, why are we talking about Northwoods when it's so well documented? I think one thing that's like we've discussed, Adam, is the influence Northwoods has had on conspiracy culture, right? So around about now, I'm going to say I noticed this around about 2010 time. Okay, really with the Boston Marathon bombing and then with the Sandy Hook shootings, this idea came out about in conspiracy culture of fake terrorist attacks, okay, where there were no victims. The victims were actors or whatever. And this has become like a much bigger meme over the past decade in a way that I don't recall anyone talking about this with the 7/7 bombings in London or with 9/11, right? There's a tiny number of people who say like, yeah, the buildings were all evacuated that day or something, but not really. I suppose people do talk about it in 9/11 and saying, well, the planes were swapped at some point. And I can only think that's coming from reading Northwoods. So do you think that's accurate, Adam, that it has had this big effect for good, right? Because it's no doubt Northwoods is like really big insight into the nature of the state and state violence and false flag terror, but also influence the way we're now looking at false flag terror.
The old proponents, the old guard of the 9/11 conspiracy circles, like Alex Jones, Jim Mars, and Jim Fetzer, actually were the first people to bring up the correlation between Operation Northwoods and the September 11th, 2001 attacks. This has a double-edged sword feel, if you will. One, it brings light into a covert military operation, which is good to the public. But two, also, it lends to the fact that that the fantastical started to take ahead or start course because of the advent of swapped out planes or CGI and all the other fantastical scenarios that come with it. What has happened because of that is that now today, if we look at forums today or conspiracy circles today, they become far more extreme in their ideals, in their scenarios. It almost borderlines banality, if you will. I hear now that the people who actually saw the planes were under, as of recent, there was a person that actually says that all the people who saw actual planes were under an MK Ultra type of program, that these people actually are agents of the state, if you will, or every single one of them. So I think that's a detriment in terms of talking about the actual anomalies of 9/11. But also, too, at the same time, like I said before, the only good that could come from this is that, yes, that there are elements of the Department of Defense or the intelligence apparatus that are willing to do detrimental things to even its own citizenry to achieve a common goal.
Okay, so on that note, I'd like to propose something to you about Northwoods. I've made one proposition that it's had this influence on conspiracy culture, right? And if I'm wrong about that, then I'd be happy to hear where like other things have influenced conspiracy culture to go the way it has. But it just seems like a connection to me. The other point I make, just to sort of re-quote a couple of things you mentioned, okay? In some ways, the Northwoods documents emphasize a care not to harm people, okay? So it doesn't say, like, just shoot down a passenger plane. It says, like, place a drone and shoot it down. In other ways, not, right? So they talk about exploding plastic bombs in Miami. Yeah, you can't really guarantee that's not going to hurt people. Injuring Cuban refugees. Well, if you're exploding bombs, what's the distinction between injuring and killing, right? And injuring, what does that mean? Like blowing people's limbs off? Sinking an incoming boat of refugees, real or simulated, right? So it's pretty clear that murderous actions were on the table here. And of course, the whole idea is to start a war. So murder is most definitely on the table. But on the US side, we talked about the airplane. Also, one that strikes me is sinking a ship near the harbor entrance, conducting funerals for mock victims, okay? And they refer to that as a remember the Maine incident, right, which refers to the sinking off the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, 1897, I'm going to go with, which essentially like it was used as a justification to start the war with Spain. The boat was meant to hit a Spanish mine. It very definitely didn't. The explosion was very definitely internal and ultimately attributed to the coal bunker exploding. So it was either there was a design flaw on those kind of ships where the coal bunkers were susceptible to going up, or it was helped along its way to get the war with Spain and ultimately take Cuba and the Philippines. And I don't think there's ever been a conclusive like answer to that. It's just interesting to see like top US military brass referring to that just casually as if it was a false flag. And I wonder if there is a kind of culture in the military of like a kind of acknowledgement that it was in certain circles. I don't know. But you said, Adam, that it would be harder to do this today, right? And here's what I like. My second proposal is that it would have been actually impossible to do this stuff in the 1960s, right? Like, how are you going to arrange mock funerals for US soldiers? Like, where do you get the people from? You know, so you've got a load of people stood around crying at this funeral, okay? And now they're all in, right? Because they know how many funerals, how many people come to a funeral? 20, 100, 200, you know? So they're all people who know, so, you know, that this scam has gone on, right? Do they talk? Okay, but that's like a military boat is still keeping it in the military. If you pretend to shoot down a civilian aircraft, suddenly you've got a whole bunch of non-existent victims, right? Is there any possibility that anyone from the media at any point is going to want to talk to one of their families? You know, like we have documentaries made about the families who lost people in the Twin Towers, including the Pentagon, right? There's a really insightful and in some ways heart-wrenching documentary about the victims, the family members of the people on Flight 77 and who were working in that wing of the Pentagon that day. So for people who think like the plane didn't crash there, I guess I don't know what they would make of that, right? That either those people are fabricated or like the family were disposed of in other ways, I suppose. I suppose that's what they make of it. But, you know, what I'm suggesting is you can't really fake something like that, not now or not in the 1960s. It's just this massive risk. So is it possible that Lemnitzer then, the actual intention was to actually shoot down a plane full of civilians and to actually sink a boat of military personnel and actually kill US citizens? But he didn't feel he could put that in a policy document and send it to Robert McNamara and President Kennedy. Right now, I don't know, but what I'm suggesting is the plan on paper is completely impossible. It just couldn't be done. And because that's what like I would say and you would say about things like faking a Sandy Hook shooting, right? Like I don't understand with this modern wave of synthetic terror, right? And I mean really synthetic. I don't mean, you know, like double agents pulling off terror. I mean synthetic to the point where there are no victims. Where do people suppose the pretend victims come from? Like the family members of the kids, the Sandy Hook kids, right? Are they like, if they're paid actors? Like if I suddenly saw you pop up on TV and say like you lost your whole family in some terrorist incident and your name's Bob, it's hang on, that's Adam, you know, he doesn't have a wife and 6 kids or whatever, you know. It's so unless these people are grown in vats underground in some secret military base and then, you know, produced for this one role, it's completely like the counter hypothesis to explain how this could be the case. It's completely impossible, right? And I would suggest it was also impossible in the 1960s. So again, I'm going to mark this out as speculation because obviously it has to be. But you know, I'm just discussing, has this idea of pretend victims ever been a real thing? Okay, and could anyone point to an example in history where a state has carried out like a false flag thing and actually just made up victims? I get you can do it in foreign lands, okay? Like the whole thing with the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter saying about babies being pulled out of incubators in Iraq that like George Bush used to get the US into the first Gulf War. Well, then you're making up victims. But, you know, it's in a war-torn country on the far side of the world. Yeah, you can do that, but not on US soil because the media is not that complicit, right? You can, and you're just creating this huge number of people that can talk. So I mean, yeah, any comments you want to make about that? Does that sound like a reasonable kind of proposition about Northwoods and current day terror?
Right. I would suggest that with Lemnitzer about creating the fictitious characters so that they can invade a country and take out the regime itself, which also at the same page, there would be casualties of war. In other words, more civilians are killed in war than the actual elements that they're fighting against. If they're willing to kill people based on false pretenses, what makes you think they won't kill one of their own to alleviate the plan itself? They would. And I think in this day and age, especially with the attacks of September 11th, to the American citizenry, 3,000 people is enormous. Not nowhere near, which is dwarfed, conspicuously dwarfed, as to how many people were killed in Iraq, which is 1.1 million. Also, it's 48,500, according to the World Health Organization, in Afghanistan. So just an enormous amount of people have been killed based on false pretenses itself. So if they're willing to do that in, say, Operation Northwoods, which I think, yeah, it's borderline, it's speculative to say the least, that they will, instead of just creating fictitious characters, that they were going to kill a plane full of Americans. I would suggest that that's true, and I would agree with you in that. Why involve so many more people when you could just allow the shoot down of an American plane and then use the pretext to invade Cuba? I think that's much more easier, especially in regards to September 11th. And I've always said that the idea of, this is what conspiracy circles, some within the conspiracy circles believe, that the hijacked airplanes were switched out for drones, and that these airplanes landed at, I think to one person, it was Andover Air Force Base, and or somewhere in Massachusetts. And you would have to involve the FAA for giving a false trajectory. You would have to involve the military, special ops, I would say, for killing the people on board those planes and then dumping their bodies. 3, the National Transportation Safety Board, who have to decipher the black boxes, the trajectories of those planes. So and also the numerous dozens and dozens, and we're talking thousands of first responders, firemen, Fairfax Search and Rescue, Montgomery from Pennsylvania, from New York, from Washington, who were involved in search and rescue operations in Pennsylvania and Washington, who had collected human remains aboard the passengers, who had collected pieces of the plane belonging to the hijack. All those people, we're talking thousands of people now, had to have been either threatened by nefarious agents of the state government not to say anything and go along the plan, or they were involved with the plan themselves. In other words, you involved so many more people when you didn't have to in the first place. Instead, all you had to do was get NORAD involved, high levels. We're talking about Larry Arnold, Ralph Eberhardt, creating these exercises that would have the intercept jets fly far away from New York and Washington and allow the hijacked jets simply just to crash into the targets, hereby killing all the people you had to kill anyway. Whether you want to say they were piloted or remote control planes, I don't disagree with remote control, by the way, because you can't really just leave it up to the hijacking pilots. It could deviate off course at the last second, but you had to kill everybody on board anyway. So that's a lot more feasible, a lot more realistic than involving thousands and thousands of people who weren't involved anyway, and also not to say anything 20 years later. And so far, nothing. I think that's the problem. I think that's what holds back the 9/11 truth community as a whole.
And what I don't see with that issue around flights 93 and 77, and we've been, quite open that you will debate anyone on this issue, right? We've not had any. We've had some takers who have disappeared when it comes to it, but we've not had anyone actually go through with that. But there's not a plausible counter hypothesis right? So there may be problems of eyewitness event, testimony, maybe. But what hypothesis could you possibly insert that would not be 10 times more complicated and 10 times more crazy? Like a plane flies down and flies over the Pentagon as a missile hits or as a bomb goes off, or Flight 77 is replaced by an equivalent kind of a plane which they fly in. Well, there's an easier way of doing it than that, you know. Just why replace it? You know, just none of them begin to make sense. You know, so I'm open to being wrong about it, but it just seems to me, like not plausible. And going right back to what seems to me to be the genesis thing, Northwoods, that doesn't seem plausible either. And I would suggest it wasn't, like, on General Lemons's mind, it wasn't ultimately going to be carried out that way.
Right. You could also think of it this way with Northwood's document, is that they had to show that they were creating a manufactured operation, but without the deaths of civilian lives.
Yeah, that's what I think. That's what I'm suggesting.
Because that would actually make Kennedy he said, "Oh, I'm not going to kill my own people for it." But I think Lemnitzer actually overstepped his bounds, thinking that Kennedy would actually agree with a manufactured operation.
Well, that the other interesting thing about it is the document treats this stuff in rather a mundane way. It's just like, it's like, it's as if these are really reasonable, normal suggestions. Okay.
Right.
Which implies that this is not some sort of radical departure from the United States military's way of approaching things in the decades prior to that. This is kind of like the norm, is what we're seeing here.
You also remember where this is coming from. This is coming from a fringe neoconservative element that is, in its essence, sociopathic. So if these people are willing to manufacture war with a foreign country based upon obviously false principles and ideals, based on a 7-page document, what else are they willing to commit to? So I think your speculation is warranted, whereas I think they would actually kill their own people. In essence, if Kennedy actually signed off on that, let's just go with the speculation that Kennedy actually signs off on Northwoods, okay, and they actually do shoot down a U.S. civilian airliner, and Kennedy actually disagrees. Well, he actually signed off on a document knowing that a war was based on manufactured principles, so he really can't disagree.
Yeah, so it's like an induction into a criminal syndicate,
right?
Isn't it? You know?
Yeah, exactly right.
You think you signed up for one thing, you get something else, and then you're in too deep.
Right, and then Lemnitzer could actually say, if we go into a scenario, hey, listen, you signed off on it. What are you arguing about? We got what we wanted, right, which was a war with Cuba. So that's what actually happened. With 9/11, it wasn't basically about hijacking the planes. I think we talked about this before. If the World Trade Centers themselves, 1 and 2, actually survived the plane impacts, that holes would be visible. But America, in essence, it would be like we took your best shot and we're still standing. The towers actually had to crumble to show defeat.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very different psychological impact.
Psychological, right, exactly right. Because with the towers still standing, they could give that America's still resolved, the resolving of American capitulation.
I mean, people say that about New York. I mean, you're in New York, I'm not, but I've heard people say New York, never really recovered from it was a different city after they came down, right?
I think I told you, I went down to Ground Zero for the first time last year, and since that happened, I could say that New York is not as, can I say, be as bold to say arrogant anymore, that bravado, that very assured self as a public itself. When that happened, it's almost like, when's the next attack coming? Because when they lost the Twin Towers, it's almost like they lost the city. They lost that innocence, they lost that arrogance, they lost that confidence. And now it's just like anything can happen. With the destruction of the 2 tallest buildings at that time in the world at one point, until the Sears Tower. But you get what I'm saying. It shows that the United States isn't as safe, or New York isn't as safe as they thought they were.
Okay, Adam, that's enough on Northwoods from me. Do you have anything else you'd like to say about it? I just wanted to do something quickly because it has been very well covered in other places, not like
Right,
the obscure
sure
stuff
has.
we usually go into. So I just wanted to, talk about this specific angle on it, on its influence. Is there anything more you'd like to say about it?
But I think the only thing I would say is real short is that a lot of people like to say that the 9/11 operation came from Operation Northwoods. And I say that's quite erroneous, to say the least. The idea of hijacking planes and using them to crash into targets came from the Bajinka plot. And that was where the first instance where they wanted to hijack planes and crash them into American targets. That wasn't necessarily detailed in Operation Northwoods. The Operation Northwoods document itself was to show that the American government, some elements within the Department of Defense, are willing to use manufactured events to capitulate on a war. So that's the difference between Operation Northwoods and the Bajinka plot and the ideas for 9/11. So if anybody's out there saying that the 9/11 operation came from Northwoods, don't be, it's a mistake. The operation itself came from the Bajinka plot. And that's for another show.
Sure, we can talk about that directly.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you, Richard.